Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Professor Hamamoto coming to you from Sacramento, California on December 29th, year 2020. It's Tuesday, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And today's talk is titled Welcome to Jim Jonestown. It's a beautiful day. Interesting solar phenomena over the last few days. And I noticed that there was a lack of heavy equipment traffic outside my little home here. And I went to go investigate it. And sure enough, months and months, I think it started back in March of 2020, around the time where the lockdown began, the whole tributary of the Sacramento River where I live by the way, I don't live in a lush riverfront property. I just happen to live by one of the tributaries. But anyway, they shut down the whole trail there for the last few months, and only recently have they opened it up. So in order to celebrate, I went on a long walk last night, and it just came all back to me. It's just so incredible to be alive, especially considering the alternative, being dead. And woke up early this morning. The sun is rising earlier, and woke up sunset or sunrise rather, and took another walk. Was gone for about an hour and a half. So enjoy your life. Enjoy your positivity. There's a lot of bad news going on right now. There's a lot to be down about, but we must achieve balance in life. And I tell you this because I tend to focus on the dark side, dark topics. They're very unpleasant. They're necessary, however. If we are to enjoy the light, we have to first progress through the netherworld, as it were. But believe me, that's not my world. I'm not a doom and gloom person. I'm not into chaos and disgust, all of that. I'm a much more positive, affirmative person. And that's really what allows me to do the work that I engage in. Toward that end, let me just, before I get into welcome to Jim Jonestown, let me just explain a little bit about my pedagogy, my methodology, if you will, my way of doing this type of work, who my influences are, because this might circumvent or perhaps prevent those who are making these inane comments from stating anything. Just watch this kind of get acquainted Q&A type, frequently asked questions type of talk that I'll give you for the next 5 minutes. Watch that before you tell me how I should do my job, how I should conduct myself as a professor or ex-professor. Because remember, the root word of professor is profess. You dig? So that means I get to lay out there what I think is important. And if whatever you think is important, go to another channel and tell that person what they should be doing. All right. So first of all, who are my pedagogical influences? That is, pedagogy is the art of teaching. There is an art of teaching. You don't just get up here and start blowing steam out of your mouth or other orifices. It requires a lot of study, discipline, and most of all, practice. And I mention this because some of my pedagogical influences might surprise you. And I think this is what makes me different in the world of teaching, the world of the university. And this is not just me saying that. This is what students have said, have documented, told me this personally and whatnot. And this irritates my colleagues to no end, because most of them are really boring in their deliveries. And it's their own fault because they don't take it seriously enough. They didn't really commit themselves to the teaching process as I did, because I take it really seriously, as you can tell. Well, one of my let me just read off a whole list of people who are my pedagogical influences. Charlie Christian, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, most of all. He's closer to my era, my epoch, right? Whereas Charlie Christian, Charlie Parker is more of my dad's generation. Miles Davis bridged over into my generation. I did see him in concert towards those later days. I never got to see John Coltrane. However, I wished I would have really enjoyed. I did see McCoy Tyner though once, which was a religious experience. So, what do these musicians have to do with pedagogy? Well, I come from the music world experientially. That was probably my first language, I think. And I've always been intrigued by it, not just the emotional content of it, but the intellectual and the historical. And I came through it because I was struggling. How do I communicate this knowledge, this vast storehouse of information that I need to impart to students? So I came into a flash of insight one day and I said, you know what? I'm going to throw away the notes and I'm just going to do like the beboppers do, or the jazz musicians. They go off what's called a head arrangement. They have a tune. See, they have spent their childhood and their adolescence and young adulthood mastering, for example, the American songbook. Plus, they learn all the jazz standards. They might have hundreds of tunes in their heads, and they can play them in all 12 keys if they're really good. So I said, I'm going to go off head arrangements from here on out. I'm going to say, okay, here's the theme. Let's call it "Welcome to Jim Jonestown," and here's the chord progression. Here's the key. We're going to do it in B flat, and it's going to be a 32 bar form. So I'm going to go to the verse, then I'm going to go to the pre-chorus, then I'm going to the chorus, then I'm going to go back to the verse, which is the head, the theme. And then I'm going to wrap it all around. I'm going to go the full circle through the whole cycle of fifths, right? And I'm going to bring it to closure by the end of the lecture. And that's how I taught my classes for the last 15, 20 years of my career. And this is what you are seeing here. I mean, in these live casts, you understand? That's why my talks here have a organic wholeness. You notice that's just not accidental. It's not arbitrary. It's not random. It's not unschooled. It's the product of a great deal of discipline and self-study. And I'm addressing younger people in particular who think that everything's as easy as going through a drive-in restaurant and ordering a Happy Meal, or powering up your Sony PlayStation and having it all fed to you. No, it takes a lot of work. So those are the musicians that I really respected and admired, revered, and have never stopped that. That's just the jazz world. We're, in the pop world, the rock world, I guess Jimi Hendrix would be a person that I have to mention. So far as groups are concerned, the Beatles, they're in a category all their own. So that gives you a little bit of background there. And I'm mentioning this because I'm going to devote some talks. These are exploratory. I'm going to devote some talks specifically to music and specifically to some of these figures of our culture, of our music, which are revered the world over, and justifiably so. Miles Davis, for example, I think I have a really good set of original insights on Miles Davis. Some of the other pedagogical influences include people like Spalding Gray, and I don't know how to classify him. He was an actor by profession. He's been in any number of movies. Check him out. He's been at least in a score of different movies. But he was known primarily, I guess, in the world of art and performance as a monologuist. And that's what I'm referring to when I talk about Spalding Gray as being a pedagogical influence. He would get up there on a very spare stage with a desk and a microphone and perhaps some rear projection. I'm talking about Swimming to Cambodia in specific, directed by Jonathan Demme, one of my favorite directors. By the way, it seems like all my favorite directors had some kind of working relationship with Spalding Gray. This includes Nick Broomfield, who did he's a documentary filmmaker, British. If it's the same Nick Broomfield, but he did a documentary on Kurt Cobain, an excellent one, a couple of other pop figures. But Nick Broomfield adapted one of the monologues by Spalding Gray, which were originally done for, I guess, off Broadway, but he adapted them for film. I think they're available still. Monster in a Box is what Nick Broomfield did. He also was had a working relation with Steven Soderbergh, and Soderbergh did I think he did a documentary film on Spalding Gray's life, right? And Everything's Going Fine, 2010, and he filmed some of the monologues. So that's one of my inspirations there. I studied these. I watched these films and seeing how Gray put his pieces together. And I recommend them. Needless to say, go out there, rent them, watch them, observe them, not just for his technique and his style and his presentation, his flow, his knowledge, his sensibility, but also for what's today called content. He's got a lot to say about the contemporary world, not just American society, but the world in general. Unfortunately, he met a watery end. He was found floating in the East River at I think it was 2004. Supposedly he committed suicide. But nonetheless, his legacy lives on. Another person, to an extent, another monologuist would be Eric Bogosian. I don't know what happened to him. I saw him. I think it was in L.A. I saw him at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion or one of the little theaters there in the Music Center area. Quite impressive, but I think Spalding Gray edges them out so far as influences go. And then to getting out of the word of monologue, I would say we're getting into radio and television here, which played probably the most important influence on my own pedagogy. And I'm very much into talk shows, chat shows, and call-in shows. Maybe this channel will morph into a late night telephone call-in show. Although I dread to imagine who would be calling me up to talk at midnight, but I might be crazy enough to risk it. And that was the career path of one Dr. David Viscott. He was a medical doctor. He was a psychiatrist by profession. He had an incredible show. There's not a lot of his material on YouTube, but if you can find it, check him out. He's very intense, very good. And I think he really could look into the heart of his callers. I think he had a really good grasp of humanity. I don't think he died of suicide, but I think he has gone to the great beyond after some years ago, perhaps. Another person that I was influenced pedagogically is Dick Cavett. He had an incredible chat show, and that doesn't really even cover it. I was watching him the other night, I think it was last night, interviewing the director, Paul Schrader, who had just done this incredible film on Mishima Yukio. He had negotiated with the estate of Mishima, who, if you don't know, was one of the most incredible writers of the modern period of any nationality. I've read most of his novels and his essays, and perhaps I'll return to Mishima in a separate talk. But he's interviewing Paul Schrader, and Schrader is quite reticent. He's very uncomfortable about being there, but Cavett manages to come to tease out really interesting insights, not into Schrader, not only about from Schrader, but from the life Schrader's insights into the life of Mishima, who, by the way, committed seppuku. It's called seppuku. It's not called harakiri. It's called seppuku. That's the formal word for it. And in the Japanese culture, it's not shameful or proscribed to commit suicide. At least back then it wasn't. Today, the modern Japanese people wouldn't understand the thought or the behavior behind it. But anyway, that's Dick Cavett. But of course, as I've alluded to him before, I think the number one influence of all is Johnny Carson. Now, in the world of so-called comedy, and I say so-called comedy because these two figures transcended the genre in the same way that Muhammad Ali transcended boxing. These two individuals, namely one, the Irish-American comedian George Carlin, who died in 2008, was beyond comedy. That just happened to be his medium. That was his venue, comedy, stand-up, and he did an incredible series of, I guess it was Showtime or HBO specials. I think I've seen almost every single one of them. I read most of his books, which were really transcriptions of his monologues. And he came up the hard way. He came out from the radio world, and he paid his dues. Now, in a category all of his own is Robin Williams, who died in 2014. He came up through, well, most people first heard of him through Mork and Mindy, a really, really, really terrible situation comedy. And I think I can speak to that. I'm an author of the first ever academic study of the television situation comedy. It's called Nervous Laughter. And it talks about how these comedies help mediate all the different tensions and conflicts in society to some sort of false resolution. Boy, do we need that now. Anyway, you know him through Mork and Mindy, Robin Williams. You look into it yourself, read his biographies. But he come up the hard way through performance, improv, and amateur night at the comedy shows, you name it. An incredible writer, an incredible mind. Most of you don't need to be reminded of that. So these are my influences when I do these talks here today. The talk being welcome to Jim Jonestown. And finally, Corky Goss, who is very active in the live chat there. How are you, Corky? He asked about the photo on my YouTube channel. There's a mystery woman there, and I'm kind of snuggling up to her, I guess you can call it. It was just a pose, right? We were at an event. It was a adult video store when they still were around. I guess those are, a relic of the past. And that person her stage name is Asia Carrera. And I never could find out her true, quote unquote, identity. All I know that she was from the New Jersey area. She was a full ride sociology major, full ride scholarship at Rutgers University in sociology. And as a child, she had played Carnegie Hall as a prodigy on the piano. And she had moved into the adult film world. And perhaps I'll devote an entirely different talk about my own scholarly work in adult entertainment. That's a whole story unto itself. So if you're interested, let me know. I'm kind of bored with the topic myself. It's kind of entered into the DNA of the culture and the society, of the popular culture and the academic culture. I've been written up quite extensively in the academic world for my contribution to the world of, I prefer to call it erotica rather than pornography. But you may think I'm splitting hairs, but I can explain that later. And for those of you who are just on the face of it, turned off or put off by quote unquote pornography or erotica, and you think it is on its own is exploitative of women or men or whoever else that wants, then you don't have to watch it. I will argue till I'm blue in the face, or at least red in the face, that erotica is about as old as human thought itself. Have you ever seen that little sculpture called the Venus of Willendorf, right? I mean, it's a cultural universal, I hate to tell you. And the reason I mention this is because there's a lot of people supposedly on our side, and I don't know whose side I'm on. I don't think I'm on anybody's side. But a lot of people assume that I hold these conservative values, like these individuals who say, "Oh yeah, adult entertainment. Ooh, oh boy." Yeah, well, I'm sorry, but I'm not with you. I'm a libertarian in that areas. Whatever you do that does not hurt someone else or people that are incapable of making their own adult decisions, it's really none of my business, and it's not the government's business, that's for sure. And but I will admit to the fact that I was always intrigued by obscenity, especially literary obscenity. How could it be that something that was put into words especially a novel or a short story or maybe a film, I can understand because that can kind of, that can get graphic. But words, you got to use your imagination. How could that ever be obscene? So I've always been intrigued by that, even when I was a teenager or a young adult, reading Henry Miller, The Tropic of Cancer. This book was banned from the United States. You couldn't read it. You couldn't obtain it. People who were coming back as tourists from France, from Paris, had to smuggle in it with their luggage. This is The Tropic of Cancer. And I read, the whole series. I hate to disappoint you, but Henry Miller is one of the best novelists in American fiction. At least in the 20th century. And unfortunately, he's not really talked about these days. So maybe I'll pique your curiosity here and you'll go back into picking up. Start with Tropic of Cancer. It's about an American expatriate in the interwar period. That means between World War I and World War II. This was the times of the movable feast, when all these Americans and Englishmen had descended upon Paris, and they had all these great salons. This is the stuff of legend. Well, Henry Miller was part. I mean, those days are gone, by the way. I hate to disappoint you. I remember. Yeah. Well, I won't go into it, but it's Paris has fallen. It has gone in a different direction. If you want to read about a contemporary Parisian intellectual writer, literary person, read Michel Houellebecq, and he'll tell you about contemporary Paris and where it's gone wrong. He's also an incredible writer of the now. So before I get into Welcome to Jim Jonestown, let me tell you how I got into the study of man-made laboratory-created disease. This is around 1982. I've been at it quite a long time. I was given a Xerox copy. There used to be these machines called Xerox machines before scanners, and we'd get articles through the Xerox machine. And as a grad student, I was constantly Xeroxing material, essays and books and whatnot, and take them home and read them. And we'd pass them around and share these articles through Xerox. Today, you would just shoot around a PDF, correct? So I was given a Xerox copy of an essay by Peter Duesberg, and I didn't know who he was back in '82. By the way, the person who gave it to me was a professor of mine in the program in comparative culture at the University of California, Irvine. The program in comparative culture, by the way, was really one of I think the first doctoral program that what today is called ethnic studies or cultural studies. And eventually the university did away with it because the other mainstream disciplines and departments said, hey, this is really good. We're going to start cannibalizing it. So eventually we became redundant. So this is what abiders will do to you. You pioneer, and then they'll come and take it from this. Just ask Prince, ask Michael Jackson. This is what happened to my department. I'm telling you this so that if you go online and try to find the program of comparative culture at UC Irvine and it's not there, you're not going to accuse me of making up a story. Because if you go to UC Davis and look in their Department of Asian American Culture, or Department of Asian American Studies, rather, you won't see my picture there either. You won't even see it's a mention of me in that department because I've been erased from the history there. Right? I'm just telling you this ahead of time. So this is how I got into initially. I read this article by Peter Duesberg, and it was just it just confounded me on many, many levels, but it went contrary to everything that I was reading in the Los Angeles Times and Newsweek and the magazine. There was no internet back then, at least on the consumer level. So I had to rely on print media and the news and legacy media, as it's called today. And it confounded me because it went contrary to everything that I was reading. But I gave it a good read. And I discussed it with Raul Fernandez. He was a Cuban-American, but he was from a Cuban-American refugee family who got a PhD at Claremont. And I mentioned this Cuban-American connection because, strangely enough, he became a Marxist, right? And Cuba was, Castro, El Jefe, was Castro. Ostensibly, they were in alignment with the Soviet Marxism. But And thinking about this, I think there might have been an intelligence, especially since he came out of Claremont Graduate School. I think there might have been some sort of intelligence, maybe an alphabet agency involved with his family and his they're being brought over to the United States. But I can talk about or think about that later. But I always thought it was strange that someone from Cuba would be a Marxist. Anyway, moving on. This is in 1982. Years later, I was invited to give a talk at the University of Texas, Austin, the main campus that's in Austin, UT. Now, this was around 2014, 2015. I'll have to look at my notes. I can't remember exactly, but it was a few years ago by now. And I was invited to give a talk since I'm known as one of the preeminent scholars of popular culture and American mass media, electronic media. I was brought in to give this special talk, and it was so special that I was allowed to present my talk in the Lady Bird Johnson room. Now, this was no ordinary conference room. It was only special invited guests and speakers could come in and use the Lady Bird Johnson room. On a day-to-day basis, it was closed for business, and so I felt quite honored by that. By the way, I got in there a day early or stayed a day later because they only pay. There's no money in academia. They only pay you for your flight and one day's stay at a hotel. So I had to pick up the tab for the rest, which I was glad to do. But the point is that I stayed long enough to check out Austin, and this is before all the Californians had moved in there in droves. And it was still pretty cool, even though there were a lot of people from around the country who were turning the UT into PCU, Political Correct University. And I ran into a couple of them. They were in film studies. None of them attended my talk, interestingly enough, even though the person who invited me was affiliated with film studies. Because guess what? They were all invested in GLBTQ studies. They were involved in what's called queer studies, queer theory. In the university. And I guess I was too, in their words, heteronormative in their mind. And the reason I'm mentioning this because one of them did attend my talk. He was my chaperone. He kind of made sure that I didn't lose my way on the huge campus, and I got to all my different appointments at the correct time, and I was able to go to the lunches and whatnot. He was my guide. And he got very upset by the nature of my talk, which I'll get into in a moment. So this is at the Lady Bird Johnson room, University of Texas. And to finish up the thread, just very quickly, but why I stayed longer is I visited the landmark Texas Tower. And this is where one of the first snipers in American cultural history took out any number of people from this really, I don't know how many feet high it is and how many stories it is, but he set himself up there. He learned marksmanship as a U.S. Marine, and he shot a number of people and wounded a lot of people, and that really astounded the nation back in the 1960s. And today, as we've learned recently in Nashville, these types of events seem to be recurrent, right? Strangely enough. But now today we know that it's usually not the person that they find or they pin the crime on. Usually we find there's other forces and agencies and entities behind a lot of these lone assassins, as they used to be called, right? I didn't know this at the time, but I wised up eventually, just like most of you have. When we see these events, I think many Americans, maybe most now, like ones in down in was it Nashville? They're not going to fall for the storyline that's put out there immediately by the legacy media. So we're growing, we're maturing as a society, as a culture. We Americans, because we've tended to be naive until quite recently, I would have to say. However, I'm very proud of my fellow Americans watching them on TV and extended news coverage where they're testifying to all the voting fraud that they have witnessed. These are everyday Americans who are going out there and speaking the truth, and it really swells my heart with pride to see my fellow everyday people going up there and speaking the truth. And these people have been threatened. They've been castigated. They've been hounded, sometimes worse than that. And in spite of that, they feel compelled that it's their duty to speak the truth. So I was at the Lady Bird Johnson room after 30 years or so of reading sporadically and not necessarily systematically about so-called HIV and AIDS. And I say so-called because it's still a question after all these years what HIV is and what AIDS is, right? Carrie Mullis, who died shortly before the full-blown rollout and lockdown of this past year, was the person who really blew the whole AIDS thesis out of the water. That was Carrie Mullis, and he's a PhD in chemistry. And then here was Peter Duesberg at UC Berkeley, one of the top, it's got to be one of the top 10 departments, not in the country, but in the world. And there he was. Let's see. Yeah, he's listed as a molecular biologist, Peter Duesberg. So between these two gentlemen there and others, by the way, of that stature, and Mullis, as you should know, was a Nobel Prize laureate. Duesberg never won it. In fact, he was put into a basement office and he was shunned. That's the worst fate you could experience in academia, is to be shunned. Myself, I didn't really mind it because, maybe I've been shunned all my life, or I like solitude. I don't know what it was, but that really didn't bother me. Because remember, I enjoyed people like Spalding Gray and George Carlin, and before that, Lenny Bruce and Henry Miller. These were all people who have been shunned, and they've been banned and barred and castigated and reviled. These are my people. I enjoy them quite, and they've helped me through my career and through my life in general. And that's why we're being denied seeing these people in live venues. This is why live music is in the process of being executed, being assassinated. This is something that musicians themselves have to step up and stop from letting Rolling Stone complete the process. So at the talk, and I'm mentioning this because this is the type of situations that you must anticipate when you're broaching sensitive areas. And I preface my talk with saying that this is not a critique about the people who have mistakenly bought into the HIV/AIDS narrative, right? This is not to shame or make fun of the people who believe that there's a cure, quote unquote, for this, that, or the other. This is not to make fun of the primarily gay lobby that said to the government, oh, please, why don't you fast track the vaccine? There's thousands of us dying daily, and they made quilts and they put them on the Capitol lawn. And if there's a trace of mockery in my voice, it's not intended, because I understand that, and I respect people who suffered under this regime. But because that was not my point. My larger point that there has been in place a decades-long project that's related to the eugenics worldview, right? And John O'Loughlin's been doing a great job in his readings, and I'm going to get off before he comes on at 5:00 Pacific time, so that you can get your tea and sit down and listen to his today's show. And I kind of structure my comments and my themes to kind of supplement or coordinate or complement his own work and the work of people such as George Webb. And both of them have talked about biolabs over the past over 4 years now. And the history is there. It's written. It may be a revelation to you, but there's tons of literature there and articles on it, and it's not original to me. I've just been able to synthesize it in a way that helps us understand that it's no longer just the quote unquote gay population that are the test subjects for these bioweapons, but it's the American population at large and the world population in general. I won't get any more specific than that because it's not germane to this particular talk. I'll let you draw your own conclusions after listening to this talk, where we're heading in 2020. So anyway, I upset this person. He happened to be gay as well. He was in film studies, and he was interested in Bhangra. He was interested in Bollywood, these extravaganzas that come out of the Hollywood equivalent of Indian cinema that are hours long. And he was also a volunteer with AIDS groups, and he called me out during the question and answer. He was very upset with what I was laying out. And he said that HIV and AIDS was real. He saw it for himself, and by God, he was going to stick to that. So rather than get upset or mad at him, I just sent him a nice email letter or message later, and I said, "Hey, watch these documentaries, and here's a bibliography. You can start reading on it." And I left it there. I left it at that level because there's really no reason to further try to convince a person who's convinced of a certain model that he's wrong or mistaken or has been misled. That's the way I handle that. So let me get into now, because we're already at the 4:36 mark. Let me get into an incredible book that I can recommend without reservation. It's by a author named Michael Myers, spelled Meiers, Myers. And I checked it out. It's still available on your mega book dealer turned retailer that's profiting handsomely under the lockdown. I'm not going to mention the name, but it's still there. And admittedly, that's where I got the book, maybe a couple years ago. The title of the book is The Second Holocaust. Let me give you the full title here. Let's see, do I have it up here? No, I do not. It's The Second Holocaust. He's referring to the AIDS epidemic that started to manifest itself during the 1980s, about the time where I was given the article by Peter Duesberg. Peter Duesberg, by the way, I shared the same attorney as Duesberg at Berkeley. I won't give you his name. I want to protect. He's a public person, though. Well, I'll give you his name. If you're in trouble, go look him up, because he's a mensch. He's good. His name's Dan Siegel. He has an office in Oakland, and he defended Duesberg against the university who was trying to get him out. He defended me from the university trying to get me out. And he also defended a guy named Dr. Chapela, who's at UC Berkeley, whose colleagues were trying to deny him tenure. So he has a really good record in helping people who are being attacked in academia for doing nothing but doing research, as we were hired to perform, right? So that's something that I'm not at the level of either Chapela or Duesberg. It's just coincidental that we have the same attorney. And I was given his name by some good sources, and I thank them because it worked out for me at the end. I can talk more about that later. Anyway, back to Michael Myers, The Second Holocaust. Where I first encountered Michael Myers was from my research that goes back years, as I mentioned. Where I first encountered him was a footnote, a citation. And that's why citations and bibliographies and indexes are so important in published work. Not so that you can parade your learning and to show that you haven't plagiarized, but it allows us to go back and find these books and these works ourselves so that we can read them and benefit. We might pick up something that you might have missed or thought was unimportant. So I saw this in a citation. I followed up on it. I found the book at the UC Davis Shields Library. And this is Michael Myers. It says, "Was Jonestown a CIA medical experiment? A review of the evidence." And ladies and gentlemen, this book was almost 700 pages long of double-space typescript. And there were 2 or 3 volumes there. So I checked it out and I kept it for, to the end of the quarter and read it carefully, took extensive notes. I have my own copy. I can't recommend that you get it on Amazon because it'll set you back a couple $100. It's not a cheap. It's an academic, very specialized book, not meant for public consumption. And that's the reason why Michael Myers wrote this book that I'm talking about, because it is written for the layperson, and it is available, and it is a piece of work that I can, without reservation, recommend to you. Let me see here. The original book was published back in 1989. It was called Was Jonestown a CI Medical Experiment? A Review of the Evidence. That's 1989. In this book here that I'm just citing, I found the PDF here. I'm going to read it because I don't want to get it wrong. It's called The Second Holocaust, How the AIDS Epidemic Was Created in a CIA Black Operation. And by the way, I sent the artwork in the copyright information, a short scanned excerpt to the people who are supporting me on Patreon. And that's the kind of extra you're going to get if you want to support my work through the Patreon. And until I get my own variety show on Netflix or Amazon Prime, we'll be going through Patreon. Or until the director on the stature of Jonathan Demme wants to do a monologue with me, doing a monologue, we'll be going through Patreon. And I appreciate your help. But this is the type of work you're going to be getting from me as a compliment to these talks that I'll be doing. These are special edition talks. I'm going to be doing one a day until January 6th. And from then I'll reevaluate where I'm going to go from there. But I'm doing these special editions. It's a limited time offer, ladies and gentlemen, January 6th. And I'm going to throw it all out there. Not all of it, because I have so much of it, but all the highlights. A lot of these talks are driven by the comments that I get down below afterwards. Oh yeah, okay, maybe I should talk about this. So anyway, let me just give you a rundown of the copy on the rear of the book here, the artwork. It's $14.95. It's a great bargain. And I'm reading here the typescript verbally so that you don't think I'm making this up. Myers first encountered this story in California's Silicon Valley in the late 1970s as a CEO of a high-tech solar energy corporation on the cutting edge of a new technology, who found himself under assault by a large group of people who were, quote unquote, all cut from the same cloth. There were Israeli nationals, a very attractive woman who had recently graduated from the University of Moscow. Does that ring a bell in 2020? Has not George Webb mentioned more than once the Iconis lures from Russia or the Ukraine, right? So this is going back in the 1970s. Silicon Valley is just a hotbed of intelligence operations from all operatives from all over the world, including our own. And of course, our own being the intelligence agencies own a lot of what we see as independent or publicly listed corporations. They're the real backers of it. I think most of you who are watching this live cast understand that. So she's a recent graduate from the University of Moscow, but most were U.S. citizens. Myers objected to their doing sneaky, surreptitious intrusions into his personal life, but since he had nothing to hide, rather than outwardly object, he succumbed and investigated them as they investigated him. What he discovered was the CIA illegally operating on U.S. soil, as well as one of their agents, the Reverend Jim Jones. And I'll leave off the blurb at this point. The Reverend Jim Jones, as he discovered, was a CIA, if not agent, at least an asset. And this he talks about in the Second Holocaust. I'm going to speed it up here because we're running out of time because of my long-windedness. But some of you like my autobiographical glosses on my fateful professional career. But this is of interest to John O'Loughlin and George Webb, who have been using the career of Mr. Thomas O'Loughlin as a way of, as a sort of not a reflection, but a refraction of the intelligence state, right? They're using his career as a military person, as a person who seemed to have been selected to occupy a certain role within the national security state, who at some point said, no, I didn't sign up for this. And he paid the if you've been following the show, most of you have, you know what I'm talking about. They've come to the name time and time again, William Colby. Now, this is interesting. And this, I don't know if George has read this book or John, but they definitely should take a look at it. But Michael Myers claims to be the last person to interview CIA Director William Colby before he was found dead by his canoe on the river. You know the story, right? And this was on April 24th, 1996. This is right after a talk that Colby gave at a local community college. And 8 years before that, Myers had published this book that I already mentioned, 1988 or 89, was Jonestown, a CIA medical experiment. So he went to the man himself, William Colby, and started peppering him with leading questions that he already had. Myers already had the answer. He wrote a book, almost a 700-page book on it, so he knew the answers. But like a very skillful attorney who's a cross-examiner who knows the answers, he's kind of teasing out the information by Colby. Now, Colby was forthcoming, fairly well forthcoming, according to Myers. And then we found this in the case of Douglas Valentine. Colby was and this is perhaps what sealed his fate. Myers would agree with this. Colby was a little bit too open about what he knew. He became the proverbial man who knew too much. And in fact, Colby had written a manuscript that had to be vetted by the CIA, and they took him to court and said, no, you can't publish it. And I think he even lost a civil action, had to pay a fine in order to settle the case. So he was trying to get the word out, and perhaps he was just in the case of Douglas Valentine, he was imparting information to Michael Myers. But shortly after their meeting, the former director of the CIA, William Colby, turned up dead. And that scared Myers off of the follow-up that he was planning for another 17 or 18 years. And as I alluded to, he had a great deal of technical training in engineering, so he was able to make a living somewhere, I think in the Midwest. He moved away and lived and worked in obscurity, just hoping to put it past him, until he himself had a crisis of conscience that had him write this book, The Second Holocaust. What caused him to have this crisis of conscience? Well, since his running away from the issue, and I don't think he would be angry with that characterization, because he blames himself for not following up on it. Because since that time till now in 2020, Myers sets the figure of deaths due to HIV/AIDS worldwide at 35 million human beings. So he's writing this book and giving us his insights, his interpretation, which we will all have to cross-check, verify, or challenge, right? As readers, as researchers, we don't take anything on faith. At least I don't. But his assertion is interesting, just in the same way that George and John have shattered the stock conventional historiography concerning the Kennedy assassination, the JFK assassination, by putting Lee Harvey Oswald in there as a CIA agent. Myers is saying that Jim Jones, the person who is responsible for this mass death, over 900 people supposedly committed suicide at this what's called the Jonestown Agricultural Medical project. This is back in 1978, before some of you were born. But if you're old as me, it's a vivid memory when this happened. It was a spectacular case. Something like that, this even today would probably cause us to sit up and listen very carefully. And of course, events like that have happened since 1978. One of them happened on September 11th, year 2001, right? So Jim Jones was a CIA operative or asset working. He was in Belo Horizonte in Brazil during the early 1960s, recruiting mercenaries, Brazilian mercenaries, and he took them, had them sent to Guyana, which was once a British colony, by the way. So I assume there's still a British intelligence presence there. They had them in Guyana for later deployment in the CIA war in Angola, right? Sounds very much like 2020. The countries have changed, but the agencies in the U.S. Intelligence and military and NATO complex are still very much active in 2020. So this book is very much relevant for our own struggles today as we are trying to set America back on the right course as being the proverbial city on the hill. And interestingly, the facility that Jim Jones was running was called the Jonestown Agricultural and Medical Project. And those of you who've seen me as a regular guest on the McDuff Show know that one of the drums I've been beating is look at the agricultural connection, especially the land grant colleges and universities in the United States, and look at the agricultural infrastructure because it very much intersects with the medical complex and the big pharma complex. And yes, indeed, Jonestown was called, the formal name was called it was Jonestown Agricultural and Medical Project. Let me move quickly into how this intersects with my own career. I'm going to end in 5 minutes, I promise you. It's already 4:52. I hope you've been enjoying this talk. I'll expand on it later if you're interested. And I have so much more for you here, not just on this topic, but some more whimsical areas of endeavor as well, including my study of adult sexuality. And I get into Masters in Johnson, and believe me, I get into the whole trip over at the University of Indiana with Dr. Alfred Kinsey, right? So this is a recent book, 2 or 3 years old. It's called The Road to Jonestown by Jeff Gunn. I recommend it. This will give you a sort of an update on the general content. It doesn't go as far as I would have, but that he's the author of that book, and I do my own research. But I will tell you that at UC Davis, where I used to teach, there is a fellow there in the sociology department who devoted a lot of his career to debunk all the different quote unquote conspiracy theories that were surrounding Jonestown. His name is Hall. I forgot his last name. I know him. I was on a committee with him. We were on a tenure review committee, and he's a decent fellow. I don't think he's involved in any sort of cover up or any kind of skullduggery. He's just doing what he thinks is honest research. But he wrote a book about it. I have it. They have a website, and the family that were involved, the survivors of Jonestown, are still debunking these theories that keep resurfacing. And I hope this stimulates a renewal of this study, because I told you it's very, very much relevant to what's going on with the big pharma, medical, and NATO move that's unfolding as we speak, right? But anyway, the reason why I think that this particular person was assigned the task of to do the historical, sociological, anthropological cleanup on what seems to be a CIA operation, if we can accept for the moment Mike Myers's contentions, then the reason for that is because there was there were a couple of individuals who had UC Davis affiliations. They were either students or grad students or closely aligned to the UC Davis community. And I'll come up with a more detailed background workup on them. But their father was very much involved with the chemical biological complex. As you will see, Mark Kulak has done a good job in kind of connecting the lineages and the family lines of all the different people. It's very helpful in tracing down the contours of what people like Professor Hall and others would dismiss as conspiracy theories. No, there are patterns, right? And pattern recognition is what I do, and it's what any researcher who's worth his or her salt does for a living. That's what poets do. They are also creating, and musicians. They're creating a storyline, a narrative. They're creating a knowledge base and a sense of understanding, deeper understanding. That's the human intellectual creative process in general. That's exactly what's being attacked right now by the neuroscientists, right? And that's another talk altogether. All right. I'm going to end at that point. And I encourage you to get yourself a cup of tea and a biscuit and sit down with John O'Loughlin and watching Macduff _2020. Subscribe to this channel. Get all your family and friends to subscribe to this channel. Support me on Patreon if you can. And we'll see you at the top, because I'm going to get that variety show. I'm going to get that talk show. I'm going to get that monologue gig, right? YouTube is the beginning for me. We'll see you at the top, ladies and gentlemen. Goodbye for now. See you tomorrow.